Trump's bold claim. Gaza ceasefire imminent amid ongoing crisis. On June 27, 2025, U.S. President Donald Trump made a striking announcement from the White House, expressing confidence that a ceasefire between Israel and Hamas in the Gaza Strip could be finalized within the next week. This statement, delivered with characteristic optimism, has sent ripples through the international community, raising hopes for an end to the devastating conflict that has gripped Gaza since October 2023. However, the path to peace remains fraught with complexities, as entrenched demands from both sides, coupled with a dire humanitarian crisis, cast a long shadow over the prospects of a sustainable resolution. This analysis delves into the implications of Trump's declaration, the challenges facing the negotiations, and the broader geopolitical and humanitarian context shaping this critical moment in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. President Trump's assertion that a ceasefire is imminent comes at a pivotal juncture in the Gaza conflict, which has claimed over 56,000 Palestinian lives, injured hundreds of thousands, and displaced countless others. According to United Nations estimates, the escalation of hostilities since October 2023 has left Gaza's infrastructure in ruins, with residential areas, schools, hospitals, and essential services decimated by relentless Israeli airstrikes and ground operations. The blockade imposed by Israel, combined with Hamas's rocket attacks and tunnel-based operations, has exacerbated a humanitarian catastrophe, with 80% of Gaza's population now reliant on international aid. Trump's remarks reflect a strategic attempt to project U.S. leadership in resolving one of the Middle East's most intractable conflicts. By framing the ceasefire as imminent, the U.S. administration is signaling its intent to broker a deal that could stabilize the region, bolster America's diplomatic influence, and address the mounting international pressure to alleviate Gaza's suffering. Yet the absence of a formal agreement and the lack of confirmation from either Israel or Hamas underscore the speculative nature of Trump's claim. This raises critical questions. Is this announcement a genuine reflection of progress in negotiations? Or is it a calculated move to exert diplomatic pressure on the warring parties? The ceasefire talks, mediated by the United States alongside regional players like Egypt and Qatar, have been mired in long-standing disputes. Israel demands the release of all hostages taken by Hamas during the October 2023 attacks and the complete disarmament of the militant group. Hamas, in turn, insists on a full Israeli withdrawal from Gaza and the lifting of the blockade that has choked the territory's economy and restricted access to essential goods. These mutually exclusive conditions have repeatedly stalled progress, with both sides entrenched in their positions. From a geopolitical perspective, the negotiations are shaped by a complex interplay of domestic and international pressures. For Israel, the release of hostages remains a non-negotiable priority, driven by intense public and political demands. Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's government faces scrutiny over its handling of the conflict, with critics arguing that prolonged military operations have failed to achieve strategic objectives while deepening Gaza's humanitarian toll. Meanwhile, Hamas's leadership, operating from both Gaza and external bases, seeks to leverage the ceasefire talks to secure concessions that would strengthen its political standing and alleviate the blockade's stranglehold on the territory. The involvement of Egypt and Qatar as co-mediators adds another layer of complexity. Both nations have historical ties to the Palestinian cause and strategic interests in stabilizing Gaza. Egypt, sharing a border with Gaza, is particularly concerned about the spillover effects of the conflict, including the potential for mass displacement and cross-border militancy. Qatar, with its financial support for Gaza's reconstruction and humanitarian aid, seeks to maintain its influence as a regional power broker. The alignment of these mediators with U.S. efforts underscores the international community's recognition that a ceasefire is not only a humanitarian imperative, but also a geopolitical necessity. The urgency of a ceasefire is amplified by the catastrophic humanitarian situation in Gaza. The United Nations and international aid organizations have sounded the alarm on the territory's dire conditions, with widespread hunger, disease, and displacement threatening to spiral into a full-blown catastrophe. Approximately 80% of Gaza's 2.3 million residents depend on humanitarian assistance, yet the delivery of aid is severely hampered by the ongoing blockade and insecurity. Clean water, medical supplies, and basic sanitation are in critically short supply, raising the specter of famine and outbreaks of preventable diseases. The destruction of Gaza's infrastructure has compounded these challenges. Over 60% of housing units have been damaged or destroyed, alongside critical facilities such as hospitals, schools, and water treatment plants. The targeting of civilian infrastructure has drawn widespread condemnation from human rights organizations, which argue that Israel's military operations violate international humanitarian law. Meanwhile, Hamas's use of civilian areas for military purposes has further blurred the lines between combatants and non-combatants, complicating efforts to protect civilians. The psychological toll on Gaza's population cannot be overstated. Children, who make up nearly half of the territory's demographic, are particularly vulnerable, with many suffering from trauma, malnutrition, and disrupted education. The long-term consequences of this crisis threaten to perpetuate a cycle of poverty, radicalization, and instability, undermining any prospects for lasting peace. President Trump's public optimism about an impending ceasefire serves multiple strategic purposes. First, it reinforces the United States' role as a central player in Middle East diplomacy. By positioning the U.S. as the linchpin of the ceasefire talks, Trump seeks to reclaim America's influence in a region where its credibility has been tested by previous policy shifts. His administration's commitment to providing humanitarian aid to Gaza further aligns with this narrative, signaling a balanced approach that addresses both security and humanitarian concerns. Second, Trump's statement applies diplomatic pressure on Israel and Hamas to compromise. By publicly setting a timeline for the ceasefire, the U.S. is effectively challenging both parties to demonstrate progress or risk being perceived as obstructing peace. This tactic is not without precedent. Trump's first term saw similar high-profile interventions, such as the Abraham Accords, which normalized relations between Israel and several Arab states. However, the Gaza conflict presents a far more volatile and entrenched challenge, with fewer incentives for either side to make concessions. Critics argue that Trump's announcement may be premature, given the lack of concrete progress in the negotiations. The absence of confirmation from Israel or Hamas suggests that significant hurdles remain. Moreover, the history of ceasefire agreements in Gaza often short-lived and followed by renewed violence raises skepticism about the durability of any deal that might emerge. For Trump's prediction to materialize, the U.S. must navigate a delicate balance, ensuring that both sides perceive the agreement as serving their core interests. The prospect of a ceasefire carries significant implications for the broader Middle East. A successful agreement could pave the way for reconstruction efforts in Gaza, bolstered by international funding and oversight. However, the question of who controls Gaza's post-conflict governance remains a contentious issue. Hamas's continued influence, even in a weakened state, poses challenges for Israel and its allies, who view the group as a terrorist organization. Conversely, any attempt to marginalize Hamas or Hamas risks alienating a significant portion of Gaza's population, potentially fueling further unrest. For the United States, a ceasefire would reinforce its strategic partnership with Israel, while demonstrating its commitment to humanitarian principles. This dual approach could strengthen ties with moderate Arab states, many of which have expressed growing frustration with the Gaza crisis. However, failure to deliver on the ceasefire could undermine U.S. credibility, particularly if Trump's optimistic timeline proves unrealistic. Globally, the Gaza conflict has galvanized international attention, with protests and diplomatic initiatives calling for an end to the violence. The United Nations, European Union, and other multilateral bodies have repeatedly urged de-escalation and the protection of civilian lives. A ceasefire, if achieved, could provide a rare moment of unity in an otherwise polarized international community, offering a blueprint for addressing other protracted conflicts. Despite the optimism surrounding Trump's announcement, several obstacles threaten to derail the ceasefire process. First, the issue of hostages remains a sticking point. Israel's demand for their immediate release is non-negotiable, yet Hamas has tied this condition to broader concessions, including the lifting of the blockade. Bridging this gap will require creative diplomacy and potentially phased agreements that allow both sides to claim partial victories. Second, the question of disarmament is a major hurdle. Israel's insistence on Hamas's demilitarization is unlikely to be accepted without significant reciprocal measures, such as a verifiable withdrawal of Israeli forces from Gaza. Past attempts to disarm Hamas have failed, and the group's access to tunnels, rockets, and external support from actors like Iran complicates enforcement. Third, the humanitarian crisis demands immediate attention. Any ceasefire agreement must include provisions for the unimpeded delivery of aid, the reconstruction of infrastructure, and the resettlement of displaced populations. International donors, including the U.S., European Union, and Gulf states, will need to coordinate their efforts to ensure that aid reaches those in need without being diverted or politicized. Finally, the lack of trust between Israel and Hamas poses a fundamental challenge. Decades of conflict have entrenched mutual suspicion, making it difficult to sustain agreements beyond the short term. External guarantors, such as the United Nations or regional powers, may be needed to monitor compliance and provide assurances to both parties. The coming days will be critical in determining whether Trump's prediction becomes reality. A successful ceasefire could open the door to broader negotiations, potentially addressing underlying issues such as Palestinian statehood, Israeli security, and regional integration. The involvement of Egypt and Qatar, alongside U.S. mediation, offers a framework for sustained diplomatic engagement. Moreover, the international community's focus on Gaza's humanitarian crisis provides an opportunity to mobilize resources and expertise for reconstruction and recovery. However, the risks of failure are equally significant. A breakdown in negotiations could lead to renewed violence, further destabilizing the region and deepening Gaza's humanitarian plight. For the U.S., the stakes are high. A failed ceasefire would damage Trump's diplomatic legacy and reinforce perceptions of American overreach in the Middle East. President Trump's bold claim of an imminent ceasefire in Gaza represents a high-stakes diplomatic gamble. While his optimism signals a renewed U.S. commitment to resolving the conflict, the road to peace is littered with obstacles, from entrenched demands to a worsening humanitarian crisis. The international community, led by the U.S., Egypt, and Qatar, must seize this moment to push for a sustainable agreement that addresses both immediate needs and long-term stability. As the world watches, the coming week will test whether Trump's confidence translates into meaningful progress or remains an aspirational footnote in the ongoing tragedy of Gaza.